So one of the things you all know, because all the conversations have been pointed around this, is that participation is happening everywhere right now. So on Twitter, that's happening every day, every hour, every moment, participation is actually happening. It's kind of amazing, actually, if you start to think about it. So if you think about Mexico last week, people were talking about what Twitter means to them. And it's a powerful thing. It means that it allows them to have a voice. They can express themselves. It means that they don't have to pay for therapy, which is a little scary. Or it might just mean that there's a visual image that really expresses this in a more meaningful way. There's also serious sharing, serious participating happening on Twitter all the time, happening in social. So we saw last week where Germany decided to open its borders so that the Syrian refugees could actually have a place to go. We saw a case in the Middle East where an Indian man's sister traveled there to actually interview for a job, and she disappeared. She was captured. She was kidnapped. So he reached out on Twitter to the foreign minister, and they actually found and rescued his sister, amazingly. We see in Colombia where a woman was having difficulty with a bank, and through participation, she got finally response and resolution for that issue. And lastly, we see a chief in Africa who's managing his entire village using Twitter, which is kind of extraordinary. So what's true? This is true for advertisers as well. We can no longer rely on the old way of marketing. So when I started my career, which is over 20 years ago now, marketing was really about persuasion. We were looking for that amazing, emotional, big idea that would persuade people to think about something differently. But really, that no longer works anymore. Participation really is the new persuasion. And this really resonated and was brought home to me when I was at Hewlett-Packard. So I spent 16 years at Hewlett-Packard on the client side of the business before moving to the agency side, before moving to the publisher side. I've kind of gone around the circle backwards. But the last campaign that I worked on at HP was for the imaging and printing group. And this was around 2006, 2007 timeframe. So think about this in the context that social really wasn't on our radar yet. Mobile was not on our radar yet. But we had created beautiful online assets that allowed people to participate. We were allowing people to build things in self-expression. And the tagline for the campaign was, "What do you have to say?" The amazing thing, though, is HP didn't want to hear what people had to say at all. And for the first time, people could actually respond back and tell us what they really had to say. And that's when the light bulb really flicked on for me, that really this whole notion of participation was more important than persuasion. And as a marketer, I understood what it meant to actually persuade people to do something different. I understood the science behind that. But I didn't understand the science behind participation. And there is one. So let's go back a little bit further in time, just to illustrate the point. Let's go back to 1982. How many of you are old enough to remember 1982? That's good. It's a good start. How many of you actually saw Star Wars in the box office? Yes? A few? Okay, so you know the movie was released in 1979. By 1982, there were actually 2 films. And by 1982, the enterprise of Star Wars had actually grossed $486 million. If you adjust for inflation, it's still the 3rd highest grossing film of all time. And the average ticket price in 1982 was $1.65, something like that. So we all kind of know this, right? And if you think about Star Wars, it was the traditional one-way communication. You sat in the audience and watched the film. You weren't participating. Well, there was also another little phenomenon that happened in 1982. How many of you remember playing Space Invaders? Yeah. And did you know that Space Invaders far outperformed Star Wars in terms of revenue? And how much did it cost in 1982 to play Space Invaders? A quarter, I heard someone say. That's right, 25 cents. Look how many quarters of revenue that was, right? So if you're a game developer, you actually hold up Space Invaders as that first game that had the secret sauce, the secret participative sauce, right? And what was it? It was the fact that players for the first time were given little tidbits to help them become more competent about playing the game along the way. They also were empowered to be part of the game more than ever before. They could use destructible barriers and hold it up to defend themselves. And lastly, they were able to connect with other players, albeit not in the way that we think about it today. They were allowed to save their scores for the first time. So what would happen, there would be this big console, and you would run back to the machine and see who would beat you, right? You didn't necessarily know who that actual person was, but you had a connection with other players like never before. That's what participation is about. So let's fast forward to today. Minecraft was built for participation from the ground up. Everything about it is about participation. You can discover and look for whatever you want. If it's not there, you're empowered to build it. And you connect with people in ways that are just bizarre, right? Minecraft is like this fuzzy Lego experience, right? How is that possible that it's so powerful? It's possible because of the participation formula. So about 4 years ago, I went off and said, okay, I've got to figure out the science behind participation. And there is one. It's self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation. It has nothing to do with marketing, never had anything to do with marketing, but it's really relevant for marketing today. From an enterprise standpoint, it's been used before for human resources. It's the formula that we create that helps employees engage in terms of keeping them in an environment where they like to come back to. It's also been used in education classrooms. How do we create classrooms where people have better learning experiences? But for marketing, I've created a formula for you, and it's not a mathematical formula, so do not try to add this up. It's simply meant to help you remember it, and it's very simple. D is about discovery, and the fact that we're humans, and we love to continually learn, but even more important than learning is we love to become competent. We love to become more knowledgeable about something. So as a marketer, this one isn't too difficult. We love to tell people about our product and service, but how often have you given people tidbits, allowed them to unlock information, to become more competent, to become more expert about your product and service? The second one is about empowerment. How do you empower people to become part of your program, part of your product and service? And we all know that this is more difficult because it's actually allowing control. But in today's social world, it's a necessity. And lastly, C is about connection. And connection is about the fact that we're humans and we love to connect with other humans who have the same passions as we do. So you can't just pick one of these or two. You need to pick all three and create that environment that allows you to have greater participation. And what happens when you have greater participation? Actions are the manifestation of participation. And we all today are measured on actions. So if you have better participation, you will by default have greater performance. So many brands are really embracing this. And I wanted to dive a little bit deep into some Latin America experiences and really talk about television, because I think television is a great place for participation today. And it really shows that we have channels like Twitter and other social vehicles that interact with TV amazingly. So if you look at Pepsi, Pepsi really owned the experience around all of the NFL games, but really culminating with the Super Bowl, and allowed multiple times during the games for people to participate with them directly, creating an amazing end result. And we found this to be true globally, not just in Latin America, not just in North America, but around the world, that people actually love Twitter, but actually they love television, but they actually love it even more with Twitter. And part of it is that Twitter actually gives people the empowerment to interact in a way with TV that they've never had before. For the first time, they can actually participate with television. So we did some research that really showed that, interestingly, almost all Twitter users watch television. And that's not necessarily that surprising. And actually, it would be consistent almost anywhere you go in the world, this is true. But a good portion of people that also use Twitter also use it while they're watching TV. And we see these numbers vary from country to country because Twitter is embedded in every culture very differently. But in general, it's true that there's a love for the interaction that exists there. So part of the challenge that we're all facing as marketers in this TV space is fragmentation. And it's really fascinating. So if I take the US just as an example, and I could do this for any country, if you go back in time to the 1950s and 60s when there were 4 stations, Don Draper had it really easy. There were 4 stations. To today, where there's really over 1 million stations from a digital standpoint, fragmentation is a big challenge for us. And obviously, 43 minutes is spent on average, if we look at a global study that actually showed this, 43 minutes per day is spent on television, but 77% of that time is also spent on another device. That could be a cell phone, that could be a tablet, that could be a laptop, that could be a gaming device. The fragmentation just continues. And users are even noticing that this behavior change is happening, right? Instead of changing the channel, I'm just changing device. So if there's a television commercial happening, I'm gonna go to my social network, or I'm gonna change devices during that moment. Can you back up one? I got a little zealous here. All right, so if you look at this fragmentation across devices, this is one of the challenges that we have, right? It's changing in terms of the number of devices being used, but it's also where people are using those devices. So this study, again, is a global study, and if you look at the dark bar, people actually using devices away from home, this continues to increase. So if you looked back over time, you would see that that bar is getting bigger and bigger in terms of the dark bar. Another view of fragmentation, and again, I could do this for any country, but if you take the US for an example, and you look even 20 years ago, so I didn't go back 50 years, but even 20 years ago is a dramatic shift happening in the TV space. So if you look at the most viewed episode of a nighttime comedy, a very popular one, Cheers in 1993, you had 80 million viewers for their most watched episode, versus in 2014, something like Modern Family only had 11 million. If you look at late night, 52 million in 1992, it's extraordinary. And this was their final episode that they did. So Jay Leno left twice. If you remember, the first time he left in 2009, he only had 8 million. He did a little better in 2014, where he had 15 million. And then the only show I could find that actually spanned the whole 20+ years was The Simpsons, who used to have an audience, an active audience on television of 38 million people, where today 7.7 is a good night for them on television. It's also, this fragmentation is causing new behaviors. So if you look at the viewing curve, or the participation curve, is changing the viewing curve. So in the morning, we used to buy morning television TV. You always had your TV on for your morning show while you were getting ready. And then there was a short period for prime time in the evening. So you look at the morning blip has really kind of gone away. People are commuting using those smartphones, as we saw, outside of their home. And if you look at the end of the day, no longer is there a big curve. It's really flattened out and really consumed even late night. And also, live moments are an incredible opportunity to capture both social, and this isn't true just for television, but it's even for moments off television. So if you think of events like South by Southwest versus 4th of July versus the Oscars, there's a huge engagement rate opportunity for brands to really connect in these moments. when people are thinking about it. So a great example here is you look at MasterChef Mexico. So obviously amazing impressions on the platform, hugely popular show. The total impression count is incredible throughout the season. But you look at a low involvement brand like Cliff. For those of you who don't know, I wasn't familiar with them. They actually are dishwasher soap. So not something you would think of necessarily completely relevant to MasterChef. They took an opportunity to engage in a very clever and creative way with a show and actually create an impact. And yes, so their engagement rates and their cost per clicks are very efficient, but what's even more amazing is that it actually drove preference for purchase. And what drove it is the combination of both TV and Twitter made a huge difference. So lastly, I thought I would touch just a few moments on what we think is next for participation. So how many of you have used Periscope? We have some scopers in the audience, we have a few. If you haven't, I would encourage you to play with it because it gives you a different perspective of the world. It shows you that if you think about our patients from 1992 in terms of participation versus today, versus where we're going tomorrow, our patience is getting less and less. And our appetite for viewing things in the moment, live and now, is only going to increase. And having tools like Periscope certainly add to that. You'll also see, because of these technologies, this really interesting culmination at events where you have people that are there physically, people who aren't there physically, in a unique way of really blending what's happening in the world. We're already seeing this with the Pope this last week, with the Syrian refugees. Amazing experiences, immersive experiences in different ways. And lastly, you'll see a plethora of short content being spun off. So we saw some of that in the presentations that preceded me. But really low budget films like Serial taking and having a hold. And brands really engaging in creative ways there. So in summary, 3 things. First of all, marketing through persuasion is over. And participation is here to stay. Secondly, if you look at social and Twitter, has given the TV audience the power to participate, which opens up new opportunities for brands. And lastly, now casting will really complement broadcasting and television of the future. Thank you.